There's a bunch of people who don't want the Gazans to leave Gaza, because who else doesn't want their people to leave? I don't know, North Korea. Now, why would a bunch of people not want Gazans to leave Gaza? Well, it's because they also want those people to remain as their sticks to beat the Israelis with. Donald Trump said, America is just going to take over Gaza. And we're going to, evacuate people out, and then we're going to rebuild, and it'll be just fine. And you might everybody freaked out. Like, what? How can he say that? How can we drive people out? How can we, all that sort of stuff. And there's a couple of things I want to point out here. One is there were some really great articles that were out there that talked about how basically Trump in those moments was speaking Arabic. Mind you, he wasn't speaking Arabic, actually, the language of Arabic, but more the means of Arabic. Meaning, when I'm walking around the shuk, the market, both in the old city of Jerusalem, I always take people around and help them, get stuff at shops. Everybody wants to bring some trinkets home with them. And one of the trinkets, somebody walks into a shop. Let's say there's a chessboard on the table. And they say, how much is this chessboard? Let's say, hypothetically, that the shop owner says, that'll be $1,000. Now, you looking at the chessboard, you're like, I ain't going to pay for $1,000 for this chessboard. So you say, I'll give you 100. All right. And there, in that process, you begin the process of negotiations. But with the shop owner saying 1,000 and you saying 100, you begin the process. You are going to negotiate. You're going to come to a point of agreement. In a sense, that's what Trump was doing with his statement that America is just going to take over Gaza. He was putting down the marker at a position. And one of the great rules of negotiation is you don't start where you want to end up. I mean, if you did, you would start halfway, and then you would end up with less. So by Trump putting out the marker that America is gonna take control of Gaza and evacuate all the people, et cetera, et cetera, he is laying down a marker, but it's a long ways from where he is agreeing to end up. And so since then, what have you had? You've had the king of Jordan come to Israel, come to the U.S. You've had the prime minister of Israel in the U.S. You've had the Egyptians. Sisi, who runs Egypt, has not yet been to talk to Donald Trump, but you can imagine he's probably maybe talking to him on the phone, or his people are talking, and there's a whole bunch of negotiations that are happening. So that was a big deal. So when I was there in Israel, a lot of the people were like blown away by Trump. They thought this statement by Trump was the greatest thing ever. And mind you, I think it's good, but I don't think it's, people seem to think that this was just like settled it. America's going to take over Gaza. They also too didn't recognize that it was a negotiation position, and it's also a real challenge, because what do you do with where do the Gazans go? Who takes them in? And there's a little problem in the fact that there were 40 Gazans who were taken as not an exchange, but they had chronic medical conditions. They were living in Gaza. They were regularly at the hospital. They had chronic medical conditions that required ongoing treatment. And so Israel helped negotiate a means by which 40 Gazans who had chronic medical conditions could go to Malaysia and get treatment. And so that was facilitated. All those people ended up in Malaysia. And there was a point, this happened in early January, where they were told they couldn't leave the compound they were on. And they got upset, they rioted, and they set fire to the hospital they were being treated at. Now, that's 40 Gazans. Now, you can imagine that, unfortunately, that is a reputation now that Gazans have in Malaysia. How many Malaysians do you think want, let's say, 1,000, 2,000, 10,000, 100,000 Gazans to come to Malaysia? Because it was on major news in Malaysia that these 40 Gazans did this in Malaysia. And so you can suddenly take off Malaysia as a place where a bunch of Gazans are going to emigrate to. And that becomes an issue other places where there is a history of people from Gaza or Palestinians being antagonistic to the regime. Most people are unaware of the fact that I think it was 94, maybe it was 93, that the government of Kuwait kicked out 425,000 Palestinians out of Kuwait. All the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from the country of Kuwait because they had sided with Saddam Hussein. And so that, the Kuwaitis have a particular view of Palestinians, and that's problematic. So it's one thing to say we're going to, relocate or allow for Gazans to leave Gaza. It's another thing of like where they're going to go, because let's assume there's 2 million of them. There's a lot of countries that don't want them, and that's a problem. And I don't think there's any good solution to this, even with Trump's saying that statement. I think the other thing that Trump does here is that, and this is where I think it's actually really important and a really good sign, is that what would historically happen, and this has been happening for almost 20 years, a little less than 20 years, but because Hamas hasn't been under control of Gaza since, it was 2006 when they took over. So assuming after 2006, every couple of years there's been some launch of rockets against Israel, some attack on Israel, attempt to breach the border, etc. And then there's Israel, does some attack, makes an incursion, takes out some people, and then the clock gets restarted. 2 years later, same thing. 2 years later, same thing. 2 years later, like it goes on, and at some point you got to say, like, we should not do it this way. Like, what if we did something else? And I think that's what's been really amazing. What I love about what Trump has said is he is trying to jack up the status quo, which is, okay, let's reset the clock. Now there's a big effort to restart the clock. Hamas doesn't want to go. One of the requirements of the ceasefire second phase is that the disarmament of Gaza, and that Hamas cannot be in charge. Now, obviously, you can imagine Hamas wants to be in charge, and so that seems to be where the real rub is.